We've been talking over the last couple weeks about how to have character in a culture that promotes compromise. And my hope is, and my prayer is, that we desire to stay strong and hold on to the faith even when times get tough. As we saw with Daniel last week in the den of lions. And today we're going to continue that thought and ask, how do you respond when the culture turns up the heat? When your feet hit the fire, how do you respond with your faith? And so we're going to look at that today. In Daniel chapter 3, it's a pretty familiar passage if you've been in church for any length of time. If you haven't, here's a quick synopsis of what happens. Nebuchadnezzar, which Tom says we have to say boo hiss, right? Nebuchadnezzar, boo hiss. All right. He sets up an idol, a golden image, and it's pretty big. And he sets it up and commands everybody to worship it. Well, that's a problem for our Hebrew friends because they have their faith and they believe that there's only one true God, and they're not going to bow the knee to anybody else. And so Daniel is not in the area at the time. We have the three other gentlemen who are left from earlier in the book. We met Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so we're gonna see them and how they react to that. And of course, they don't compromise. And with that, they face the penalty for that, which is death. And so the way that Nebuchadnezzar had for this particular death sentence is he had a fiery furnace. He was going to throw everybody who didn't comply into the fiery furnace. That was his method of execution. Pretty gruesome. There's a lot of ways that I don't want to go from this life. And fiery furnace is one of them, right? That's not high on the list for me. So that's where we are. Is there's the threat of death, there's the call to compromise, and these three men stay firm. And of course, the end of the story for us is that God spares them from the fire. He walks with them, and they come out of the fire. But my favorite part of the story is they come out of the fire without even the smell of smoke on them. Right? Remember when they had smoking sections in restaurants? Right? You'd get the smell on you just by being close to it. They walked out of the middle of the fire untouched. It's a pretty great story. So we're going to dive into this morning, and the whole problem starts in Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits, its breadth 6 cubits, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So he creates this enormous statue. A cubit, it was usually measured from fingertip to elbow or somewhere in here. It's about 1.5 feet. It's a little bit longer than a foot. So we're looking at a 90-foot statue that's 9 feet across. Now, that's kind of weird thing. So scholars love to debate was it a pedestal with a statue on top, or was it just a real skinny statue that was 90 feet tall? It's huge, though. It's an enormous statue in the middle of this plain. You can see it from anywhere, right? Flat land, big statue. You're going to see it from anywhere. And the call is when the instruments start playing, and they name the instruments one by one, and we get redundant how many times they name the instruments over and over and over again. When they start playing, everybody's supposed to bow down and worship the statue. So we've also been talking over the last couple of weeks about the Babylonian culture and how it promotes compromise. It's really not unlike our culture today. So I want to define what we mean by compromise. Cindy and I have discussions frequently when we're out and about, and it goes something like this. Maybe you've had a similar experience. The conversation goes like this: what do you want to eat? Ooh, I don't know. What do you want to eat? I don't know. What sounds good? And we go back and forth on this, and it could be a long time. So there are things that I like, things that she likes. There's the food that we like together, which is a smaller subset, right? And then you factor in, am I in the mood for Mexican food today? Am I in the mood for a burger? And so you have to filter in the mood, the way the sun is shining, all that stuff comes into play. And finally, we make a decision on where we're going to eat. It could take a while, but we get there, right? I haven't missed many meals, right? We compromise and we get to that spot. So there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things where compromise is good. That's not the type of good compromise we're going to talk about today. That's the compromise these three Hebrew men had to make was much more significant. There's a lot of areas where compromise can be good, but there's one area, specifically one area, where we can never compromise. No matter how much heat the culture puts on us, we must never compromise in the area of faith. So for our purposes this morning, let's define compromise like this. We'll define compromise as making decisions or actions based on serving the wrong God. When you make a decision, when you make an action based on serving the wrong God, we've moved into this area of compromise. And let me explain that a little bit. So Daniel 3 conveniently comes after Daniel 2. It's kind of how numbers work, right? So Daniel 2 comes first, then Daniel 3. Here's the interesting thing. Daniel 2:47, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, boo-hiss, right? The king answered and said to Daniel, truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. For you've been able to reveal this mystery. Now, we're going to talk in a few weeks about what brought him to this statement. This is a bold statement, and there's a story that gets him here. But isn't it interesting how he can make such a powerfully true statement about who the real God is, and then just a few verses later, he creates an idol, a false god, and commands everyone to bow down to it? What creates that shift, right? What creates the shift from him declaring, your God is the God of gods, to forcing everyone in the nation to bow down and worship an image of gold, a false god? See, I think a big reason for this is that Nebuchadnezzar was very comfortable with having many gods. They had a lot of them. And he had no issue adding Daniel's God. He had no issue adding that to his life as long as it didn't disrupt what he already had going on. As long as he could keep all of the other things he worshiped, he would be glad to add the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and bring it into that. But ultimately, I believe that his biggest object of worship was himself. He had all of these gods, he had all of these things that he worshiped as long as they enriched his life, and he was the center of everything. And the text doesn't say what the image of gold is, but a lot of scholars believe he made an image of himself based on what we're going to talk about in chapter 2 later. He made an image of himself for everybody to bow down to. He was the most important thing in his life. And he would be glad to add a god or two or three as long as they didn't interfere with the fact that he wanted that center stage. And before we give him too much grief, sometimes we get comfortable with having many gods also. Of course, we don't usually call them gods, right? That would be a little too far. But we tend to give things in our life equal weight that we give to God. We tend to give things that are outside of God himself equal footing in our life. Things like jobs and relationships, life goals, and even hobbies. These things can all be elevated to God-like status in our lives. And just like Nebuchadnezzar, I think it's easy for us to add God to our packed lives instead of surrendering our life to his will. We can easily worship many different things and still have ourselves at the center of it all. And that's where Nebuchadnezzar went wrong, and I think that that's where we tend to lean if we're not careful. So when I say compromise is making decisions or actions based on the service of the wrong God, what I mean is when the pressure rises, when our feet hit the fire, when we feel the heat of the furnace right next to us, are we going to choose to worship the true God, or are we going to choose to bow down to ourselves and pick things like comfort and safety, advancement, social acceptance, all the other things that we really value in life? Are we going to worship those things, or are we going to hold true to God? So it seems easier to choose to do what's right when everything is going well, doesn't it? It's a lot easier when things are going smooth to say, "Whoo, thank you, God, things are going great." The problem is that choosing to serve God is not always easy. It's not the easiest road. It's the best road, but it's not always the easiest road. And the real test begins for us when we have to make a choice that might cost us something. And for these three young men in our text, their choice could have cost them everything. In verse 6, Nebuchadnezzar gives them his ultimatum. He says this, "And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." So for them, the heat is on, right? The choice is now between life and death. And for us, most of the time, the stakes aren't quite as high, but they can still be consequential, right? We can face extreme pressure to give in or go with the flow, or we have 100 different ways of expressing that idea, and it makes it a little softer than what it really is, and that's a betrayal of our faith, right? And this can come from internal sources like a desire to fit in, or some past trauma resurfacing, or it can come from external sources where others try to impose compromise on you. That's what we have here. Either way, when the heat is on, what will we choose? Will we choose to serve God even if it costs us something? How about if it costs us everything? Are we still willing to serve? Are we still willing to choose God? If the true God is really the God of our lives and not just some add-on deity, then we must make our decisions based on his will and his plan for us. When we start making our choices and our actions based on the wrong God, we move into the area of compromise. And so to stay away from compromise, we have to keep God in the center, and we have to worship him regardless of how much it costs. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they know going into this, if we make this choice, we are choosing to lose everything in order to hold on to God. And they make that choice, right? Here's one of the things I love about this passage, though, is that there are three of them, right? There are three of these young men, and together they stand strong. They choose not to bend their knee to the idol of gold, but they do it together. And I think this is an important idea. Find friends that fuel your faith. Find friends that fuel your faith. How easy would it have been? You got the three guys there. The mandate is bow or get thrown into the fire. How easy would it have been for one of the three guys to say something like this? Hey guys, we love God. Everybody knows we love God. There's no question about that, right? So what if we, just go with me here, what if we just bowed our knees today and then tomorrow we could get back to loving God, right? What if we just took a break for a second? Because if you really think about it, it's really hard to serve God when you're dead, right? So this is really us helping God, right? We just compromise now so that we can live another day to serve him later. And it would have been really easy to talk ourselves into compromise, isn't it? It's real easy to find ways to make it seem better or to make it seem right and to compromise our faith and make it sound palatable at the same time. And it would have been real easy to get talked into compromise, especially by those that are closest to you. Instead, though, they bolstered each other's faith. All three of them together faced the furnace. They faced it together. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 13, it says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. And so they brought these men before the king." Now imagine this scenario. They're now standing in front of the source of the enormous pressure that they faced. They're standing in front of the one, he's the most powerful person in the world right now, right? And they were given one more chance to compromise. I can't imagine the tension in this moment, right? All they have to do is say, okay, we'll bow. I mean, it's not that hard of an action. They could have done it almost accidentally. They could have tripped and fallen and bowed, right? They didn't. They stood strong in the midst of this unbelievable tension. The most powerful king in the world is ordering them to abandon their faith, and the consequences are death. I don't think you can get much higher stakes than this, right? And in verse 16, they say this: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. They were unified in purpose. These three men stood firm and would not submit. How awesome is that? They didn't even have to discuss it. There wasn't even a conversation. It's like, oh, king, we don't even need to answer you. You already know our answer. We don't need to discuss this. We've already made up our minds. We're going to follow God at any cost. And no matter what you put in front of us today, we're still going to hold on to that truth. They understood the cost, and they still kept themselves from compromise. Notice the difference in temperament, though. I find it really interesting. Nebuchadnezzar is furious, in rage, right? The three young men calmly make their choice. We don't even need to reply. You know our answer. It has been the same from day one to today. We're going to hold fast to God. We're going to hold the truth that there is one God, and we will bow the knee to no other. Right? I believe in moments like this, there's peace and strength in those moments where you choose God under pressure. There is a supernatural moment where God is present in those times, and there's peace and there's strength in the moments where we choose God. As you fully trust him, you know that the outcome is in his hands. And so they make this declaration of devotion to God, and they let the king know that they will not compromise their faith. They say this in verse 17 and 18, if this be so, if what be so, if you decide to throw us into the fiery furnace, which you've already said you're going to do, if this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They make this declaration of devotion, right? They speak it out loud. This is what we're going to do. They get together and they have friends that fuel each other's faith. And they've made their decision ahead of time. We're not going to compromise. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were not undercover Christians, right? They used this moment in the sun, right? This moment, the spotlight, to point to God. Where Nebuchadnezzar had added his own little small view of God to his agenda, these young men boldly pointed to the true God, the God who is able. He is able to change your circumstances. He can do whatever he wants to do. Our God is, let me just say this, our God is an all-powerful God. And I know when I say that, a majority of people in here are already on board with me, right? Everybody nod your head. Our God is an all-powerful God, right? Everybody agrees with that. But when the pressure begins to crank up, when the heat gets turned on, we tend to forget that, right? We get in those moments and we lean toward compromise because we tend to either to ignore the fact that God can do whatever he wants to do, that God is all-powerful. We tend to forget that he can do that. And as the furnace gets hotter, our trust can begin to waver, can begin to tremble. But God is able. He can change everything in a moment. These young men looked the king right in the eye and they said, your furnace, no matter how hot it is, your furnace is still in his hand, right? You may seem to have all the control. You may seem to have all the leverage, but the reality is God is still on the throne. God is still in control. And you have a furnace, but your furnace is in his hand, and his will matters. He can change everything. He is able. I want you all to say that with me this morning because it's really important. He is able. Let's say that together. He is able. Here's the question. He's able, but what if he doesn't? Right? Daniel 3:18 says this, but if not. That is an incredible word of faith. But if not. O king, our God is able. God can do whatever he wants to do. God can save us from this furnace. But if he chooses not to, we will still stand strong. This would be a much easier message to preach if it was like a formula, right? You do this, you pray 3 times, you do this. If you do everything right, God will always save you from the furnace. That would be a much easier message to preach, but that's not this message. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, much like Daniel last week, had no idea what the result of their choice would be. The logical result is they were going to give their lives for God in this moment. And chapter 3 happens before chapter 4, so they don't even have Daniel's example to look at yet. Right? They look at this and God can save them. They fully believe that. But even if he doesn't, they're still going to choose him. That is a huge statement of faith. They fully understand that they are headed to the fire and they were willing to give it all up in pursuit of God. As we look at that, I always wonder how long it took him to figure it out, right? Nebuchadnezzar's mad. He's real mad. And he's really powerful at this time too. So when powerful people get mad, bad things happen. And so he's real mad. He's like, you know what? The fiery furnace isn't enough. Let's crank it up a lot. And so he cranks it up so much that the guys that are throwing them into the fire, they die. They burn up. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get in the fire, and the guys that threw them in are dead. I wonder how long it took him to figure out, Shadrach, this is supposed to hurt, right? Like this fire, right? Is this supposed to be painful? Because it's not. I don't know what's happening. And then God shows up and walks with them, right? They are walking with God in the fire. Wouldn't you love to hear that conversation as they walk together? I don't know if they're taking laps, getting some steps in, how they're doing it, but just spending moments with God in the middle of the furnace. You would love to hear that conversation. But if not, those words, I think, ring out today to me. Because for every party inside the furnace, there are hundreds, if not thousands of people, Christians, that have come to that same decision point. They chose God, and God chose not to rescue. Right? He chose to rescue the 3 in the furnace, but how many thousands of martyrs do we have that came to that same point, and God chose not to rescue? In the early days of Christianity, there's a profound story about 40 soldiers, 40 Roman soldiers who stood firm in their faith. You may have heard this story before. For them, instead of a fiery furnace, it was a frozen lake. They were a Roman legion stationed outside of Armenia, and the command came down from Caesar that every Roman soldier had to renounce Christianity. It was no longer allowed. And these 40 soldiers refused. This was their declaration of devotion. We are 40 soldiers for Christ. We will not deny him. And so they stripped them down. They moved them to the center of this frozen lake, and they gave them an opportunity to renounce their faith. And as the night went on, it got colder and colder, and they're stripped down in the middle of the lake. It was freezing cold. One of the soldiers made a break for the shoreline. They had set up hot baths and everything within eyesight, so it was very tempting to leave their faith behind and go to the comfort and safety of the baths. And so one of them broke for the shoreline, and he renounced his faith and got in the heat, the nice warm water there in the freezing cold night. Here's the interesting thing is there was another soldier who was stationed to guard around the lake to make sure that none of the 40 escaped. And he saw this, and he was moved in a supernatural way. He saw the 39 soldiers that held onto their faith. He saw the one that ran away. He saw the 39 that even if it cost them everything, they were going to choose Christ. And so in that moment, he chose Christ. He stripped down and he ran out to join the others in the middle of the lake, and they cried out once again, We are 40 soldiers for Christ. We will not deny him. All 40 of them perished. The ones that survived the night, they burned the next morning. All 40 of them perished. Here's the question. He is able, but what if he doesn't? Does that change your perspective? Does it change your view of God's character? How can he answer some prayers yes and some prayers no? How can he save the 3 from the fire but let the 40 in the cold perish? How do we make sense of that this morning? And so, first of all, I'm going to say, I don't have all the answers, right? But I do know these 3 things to be true. The first thing that is absolutely true is eternity is so much better than our current reality. God has handcrafted a place for us, and we will enjoy his goodness forever and ever and ever and ever. And so when our perspective is just here and now, things don't make sense. But when our perspective moves out and we see eternity, it begins to take a little bit of a different picture. Those 40 soldiers gave up their lives, but one was redeemed, right? And God is looking at eternity. This is a small portion of who we are and a very, very small portion of who we will be because we exist to live with Christ forevermore. And that's the second thing, is God doesn't want anyone to miss out on eternity. He has planned for us an eternity that is absolutely amazing, that we get to live with the presence of God, and the times that he rescues and the times that he does not are all part of his plan to redeem as many people as possible so that no one misses the eternity that he has crafted for us. And that's hard for us to see because we're in this little slice of time, this little moment. But God sees the big picture. And as he's weaving this incredible story together, he has a place for us. And he has a plan for us. And sometimes he answers that in a miraculous way, and sometimes he doesn't. And it's hard for us to understand because we don't have the mind of God and how he's working all things together for good. Here's the third thing I know to be true, is that God is pleased when we have faith, when we trust him, absolutely trust him, that he is good when he rescues and that he is equally as good when he does not. That is a huge moment of trust. These 3 men had that. Verse 18, but if not, if God doesn't show up today, he can. King, I need you to understand, God can do whatever he wants to do. He could put out the fire before we even get there. He could rescue us through the fire, which is what he did. But even if he doesn't, we need you to know, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. We will stand firm regardless of the outcome, regardless of what happens here today. We're going to choose what's right. And that is the step of faith. We're going to choose what to do regardless of the outcome, because sometimes God rescues, sometimes God does not. Because the purpose is not whether God does something miraculous or not. That's not the purpose. The purpose is presence. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. And he answered, but I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. God is present for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. God was present in the fire. He is present when he saves us from the fire. He's present when he saves us through the fire. And he is present when the fire seems to win. God is here. And we need to strive to find this place in our faith journey where we're satisfied in the presence of God, regardless of the outcomes, regardless of the circumstances, that we choose not to compromise, that we choose Christ, and we find satisfaction in his presence, regardless of how everything works out for us. In his presence, we can find joy, we can find satisfaction, We find fulfillment. Outside of that, we will always be wanting more. Outside of the presence of God, if your goal is his presence, you'll never be disappointed because his promise is that he's always there. He'll be with us even to the end of the age. If we make it all the way to the end, God's there with us. So here's the question this morning. Will you stand in the face of the fire? Pressures come. We've seen them, right? Pressures come and go. When culture starts to turn up the heat, when the pressure comes, will you choose to stand? When it's easier to give in, will you still stand? When it costs you something, if it costs you everything, would you still stand?